Thank you, Gloria. Can everybody hear me okay? Well, it's a pleasure to be here, and it's particularly gratifying to look out and see several of my mentors that I studied under when I was a student here. Bob Stallings, who's sitting way in the back, was my dissertation chair. Jim Barron, sitting in the front, was the dean of the School of Gerontology. So I want to welcome all of you, and it's nice to see the familiar faces. I'm going to be plowing through a lot of topics today, trying to give you a background and overview of elder abuse and then looking at some of the specific ways to address it. So I'll be talking about what it is, and it isn't any one thing, but there's lots of different types, which makes it kind of hard to get your arms around. Talking about what we know about the prevalence, the risk factors, the characteristics of victims, what we know about who perpetrates elder abuse, some of the conceptual underpinnings, where are we in terms of preventing elder abuse, and a little bit about what you can do about elder abuse. So let me start by saying that one of the problems we have is that elder abuse really isn't well defined. It started with state statutes and state policies and kind of developed from there, and there hasn't been a great deal of systematic research in elder abuse, so that's just starting to be funded. As a result of these state policies, there's no national standards, there's no commonly agreed upon definitions, which makes it really difficult then to start looking at what is elder abuse and how frequent is it a problem. Also, there's different types of elder abuse, and I'll be talking about, we tend to lump those all in one kind of big elder abuse concept, but they're really very different. Another problem is that there are different fields which inform elder abuse. There's child abuse, but that's a dependency model. There's intimate partner violence, and that addresses the physical and psychological elder abuse, but there's financial elder abuse, which is kind of something completely different. The other problem, and I won't spend a lot of time on this, I heard a wonderful presentation a couple years ago on this question: what is an elder? Who is an older adult? And in the state statutes, that varies. So sometimes it's 60, sometimes it's 65. Some state statutes just say a dependent adult. So this makes it kind of complicated to start developing a research agenda. I want to read a case study, actually, that I made up, because I have wonderful case studies, but I'm reluctant to use them because of concerns among the agencies that I'm working with. So I want to read this case study, and I want you to kind of think about it. And as we go through, I want to clarify what's going on here. So Mrs. G is a frail widow in her early 80s. In failing health and increasingly unable to care for herself, she's lived with her son and daughter-in-law and their 3 adolescent children for over 2 years. The daughter-in-law, Lucy, was compelled to give up her job to care for her family's needs. As her mother-in-law became increasingly dependent, Lucy found herself struggling to cope with the overwhelming burden of elder care and with managing her family. To her shame, she lost her temper on more than one occasion, striking her mother-in-law and verbally abusing her. She found herself threatening to send her mother-in-law to a home and telling her that she was ruining her life. This is a fairly common sort of stereotypical scenario of elder abuse. It's an overburdened caregiver in a sandwich generation who is well-intended, but she lacks the support and coping skills to make it work. Now, if you could keep Lucy in mind as we're going through, and then I want to give you a couple of other assumptions. Assume that Lucy was raised by her grandmother, a harsh and bitter woman who physically and verbally abused her. Do you think that would make her more likely to be abusive in her relationship with her mother-in-law? Would she be more likely to abuse her mother-in-law if her mother-in-law was verbally and perhaps physically abusive to her? Suppose her mother-in-law had Alzheimer's disease, and when she felt particularly threatened, such as when Lucy was trying to bathe her, she would lash out and verbally strike her mother-in-law. Would that increase the risk of elder abuse? So I hope by the end of the presentation you'll have some answers for, are these risk factors for elder abuse? As I said, this is what's commonly found in the early literature on elder abuse. So I want to just start for the next few minutes looking at what is elder abuse. This comes out of the National Center of Elder Abuse, and at the end I have some of these websites. If you're interested, you can go and look at it. But it's knowing, intentional, or negligent act by a caregiver or any other person that causes harm or a serious risk of harm to a vulnerable older adult. So it's very broad. There are some things that aren't defined, and one of the themes that we'll be coming back to is what is vulnerable? What characterizes a vulnerable older adult, and then how does that address what we can do about elder abuse? There's a variety of different types, and depending on what literature you read, some of these types are folded into others, so I just want to quickly use a definition by the National Elder Abuse Center. Physical abuse is inflicting or threatening to inflict physical pain or injury, again, on a vulnerable elder. It can be hitting, kicking, striking, those kinds of activities. And actually, physical abuse, I think we're all most familiar with what that is. You can kind of see it, you understand it. It comes out of an intimate partner violence paradigm. Psychological abuse, inflicting mental pain, anguish, or distress through verbal or nonverbal acts, is a little bit more difficult to get a handle on, because what's psychological abuse for one person may be perfectly comfortable for another person. So it's that relationship and that sense that the person is feeling threatened and abused. Sexual abuse, non-consensual sexual contact of any kind. Financial exploitation, and I'm going to be concentrating actually a bit more as we go along on financial exploitation, but it's illegal taking, misuse, or concealment of funds, property, or assets. So again, a broad definition. Neglect, refusal, or failure to provide food, shelter, health care, or protection. One of the issues with neglect is what's neglect and what's honoring the autonomy of an adult. So we had a case recently where the individual was alcohol abusing, living in not very good conditions in her own home, and there was questions about should the daughter intervene, and was it neglect for the daughter to not intervene. So there's a boundary issue. Does the woman have a right to live in her own home in those kinds of conditions, and what are the obligations of potential caregivers, and what are the boundaries there? Those are fuzzy. Abandonment, desertion by one who has assumed responsibility. And again, then that puts some risk to assuming responsibility for people. And then self-neglect, sometimes this is included as elder abuse, and sometimes it isn't. But it's the individual neglecting their own care. And as we'll see, it's a very common type of elder abuse problem, but the question is this really elder abuse, or is this something else that we should look at sort of under a different conceptual framework? How prevalent is elder abuse? Wonder if I should ask you, just think about what you think. How common a problem is elder abuse? I'm just going to run quickly through some of the studies, sort of where we are with answering this question. How many people think it's rare, say, under 2 or 3%? No one thinks it's rare. How many think it's fairly common? Over about 25%, 1 in 4. So most of you think it's fairly common. Okay, so here we go. Early studies were based on convenience samples, and they show that about 4% of older adults were abused. Now, this was very different from what people were seeing in health and social service agencies, where it was about triple that. So people coming to the hospital, coming to social services, were much more likely to be victims of abuse and vulnerable. In 1988, Carl Pilmer did the first random sample study. He did it in Boston, and he looked at 2 kinds of abuse, physical and psychological abuse. And it was an elegant study, really well done, and it found some surprising things. He found about a 3% prevalence rate, and 2/3 of what he found was physical abuse. And here's one of the most surprising things. 51% of the perpetrators were spouses, so this is intimate partner violence into older age. And one of the things he found, and we'll see this conflicts with other work, is who do you think was more likely to be victims, men or women? In his study, men slightly more likely to be victims. Why? Because they live with a spouse, so they were more at risk. This is very different from what some of the other work has found. Then actually Carl Pilmer and others worked on a Canadian study, and they added neglect and financial abuse, and they found, again, 4%, with financial abuse being the most common type. And again, spouses were more likely to perpetrate physical and psychological abuse. So then, since then, there's been a number of national studies in different countries, no national study in our country. But what's interesting is they show fairly consistent findings. About 4 to 6% of older adults are victims of abuse in these studies. Now, as we go through, we'll see how broad a definition are they using, how broad a definition of financial abuse is, self-neglect included. So all those things make a difference. But what it shows is this is, it's a troubling problem. The prevalence level is about 1 in 20. So based on that, Congress funded what was called the National Elder Abuse Incidence Study in the U.S. But they used reports to the agency called Adult Protective Services. Every county has an Adult Protective Service agency, and they're the ones that take all the reports of abuse and they investigate abuse. So this was looking at their records, and they also use community sentinels in social service agencies. And for 1996, they found an incident rate of about 550,000 people. This included self-neglect. Where does this take us? Well, a lot of the advocates say that much of elder abuse is not reported. They call this the tip of the iceberg problem, that it's a hidden problem, that it doesn't get to adult protective services, and that even in studies, people are reluctant to admit that they're victims of elder abuse. So some say 1 in 5 are, and this, it's interesting because I would say this is somewhat of a squishy number, 1 in 5, but it's out there and you see it all the time in reports, in proposals. Others say only 1 in 20 are reported. Some of these are people who are pushing hard and legitimately to get this on the spotlight. One of the things that's never talked about is false positives. So we have what's reported, and we have what's sustained, and we have, again, these gray areas of, was that neglect, the issue I talked about with the daughter not intervening with her alcoholic mother? How do we address these kinds of issues? So, and how do we standardize the definitions? I want to talk really briefly about mandatory reporting. Almost all states, I think 42, have mandatory reporting laws, and this means that professionals who encounter elder abuse or dependent adult abuse are required to report it to Adult Protective Services. Unless it's in the nursing home, then it's to the Ombudsman program. Adult Protective Services investigates, but one of the criticisms is they do an investigation, but they have very little clout to actually do any sort of intervention. So part of the investigation is to determine what's going on and what can be done, and I'm going to talk about that more at the end in terms of what can be done. But this is where we're getting a lot of our information. In California, in 2007, banks were included as mandatory reporters. Banks are in a position to see a lot of financial abuse. And what we're seeing in the Forensic Center that I'm going to talk about is they are now reporting financial elder abuse or questions of financial elder abuse. So why doesn't it get reported? Why doesn't it get identified in studies? First of all, the stigma. Somebody was talking to me yesterday about her discussions with an older person who said something about falling for one of these scams, and she tried to probe a little, and the person was, no, I'm too embarrassed, it's behind me, I don't want to talk about it anymore. Perpetrators also try to isolate the victim. So many times this happens behind closed doors, in settings where there is really no access to the outside world, and sometimes this is actually often it's a strategy. We have a live and let live culture We don't want to rock the boat. There was a kind of horrific elder abuse issue that I was involved with a few years ago where I won't go into the details, I don't have time, but the next door neighbors were aware of this. And the police finally came by and they said, well, you were aware of it. And they said, we prayed fervently for it to be addressed, but that was all we felt we could do in the situation. We didn't feel we could get involved. There was, in this case, perhaps a little bit of a fear of retaliation because these were really nasty people who had gotten in there. Lack of knowledge. There's a lot of evidence that, for example, physicians don't report as much as might be expected. Some of that relates to disagreement about what constitutes abuse. I was talking to a physician recently who was very angry at a social worker who had come in. There was some family dynamics that the physician was aware of. The father was mad at the son. The father was in the hospital. The son was the caregiver. But the physician thought they'd work on supporting the son and things would be fine. The social worker reported it as elder abuse. It blew up. The physician was furious. So there's those kinds of problems too. What will happen if abuse is reported? Will it make it better? Or will it just rock a vulnerable boat without much intervention? So this is what gets reported to Adult Protective Services. Again, so these are the reported studies, the reported evidence out of the states. Self-neglect is the largest one. Sometimes these are individuals who have lived their whole lives. If you've ever done seen anything about hoarding behavior, it's not only older adults, people with 80 cats living in their house, those kinds of things. Sometimes I say I've seen pictures of hoarders, and I say this looks like my kid's room, just with stuff piled up and chaos. But sort of when does that reach the level of a problem? And neglect. So if we look at self-neglect and neglect, that's more than half of what gets reported. Then financial and emotional at 15% and physical at 11%. And it should, I don't know what happened to that, it should say 1% and 8%, I think. 1% for sexual and 18% for other. So here's what we know about prevalence. We need better definitions and standards to get a handle on the prevalence of elder abuse. There's no national studies that meet research standards. The consistency across studies, both in this country and other countries, seem to indicate about 1 out of 20 older adults are victims of abuse. And the most common types of reported abuse are self-neglect and neglect. So who are the victims? The early studies show that the victims were older, frail women who lived with abusers, similar to the case study that I read in the beginning. Then the Boston study showed that men were actually more likely to be the abusers. Then the National Elder Abuse Incidence Study, the one that looked at APS, again found it's older women. And as I said earlier, some of the evidence is that this is conflicting from the prevalence studies and the APS studies because older women's abuse is more likely to be egregious and reported. That's at least what the researchers are saying at this point. One of the issues for elder abuse is looking at signs and symptoms. So if a physician is going to report abuse in the emergency room, someone in social services is going to report abuse, what are the signs and symptoms? And I think you would probably be fairly familiar with what these are. For physical abuse, bruises, pressure marks, broken bones, abrasions, burns, unexplained withdrawal from normal activities, or depression. Now, one of the problems with some of these is they can be from other conditions as well. So if someone withdraws and is depressed, that may be a sign of elder abuse, but it may be a sign of other things as well. Bruises around the breast or genital area from sexual abuse, and physicians in particular are frontline screeners that should be noting if there's evidence of sexual abuse. bed sores, poor hygiene. Again, though, these can be evidence of other things. The geriatrician at the forensic center has twice had the same case where an adult daughter caring for her father who has a terminal illness has been reported for abuse. This scenario is this. The father's wishes were to die at home. So the daughter has given up a lot of her life and is caring for him, and his care is very difficult, very complicated. So the concerns were that he was suffering from bed sores and malnutrition. The geriatrician went out and she said, yes, indeed he is, but this is not because of her care. He could be in the hospital, and because of his illness and that he's at the end of a terminal illness, these conditions would still be evident, and that she should be acknowledged for really doing wonderful work to honor her father's wishes. So she said that as this came to the forensic center. Lo and behold, this case got reported again when she took him to the hospital for some follow-up care. So the other side of elder abuse is how do we work with families with the best intentions who are trying to support their elder and differentiate this from legitimate neglect. So I always have a little bit of concern as we look at these risk factors to know, yes, these are risk factors for abuse, but what else might be going on? Belittling behavior, threats, use of power and control. With financial abuse, I've known a number of scenarios where the abuser says, if you don't give me the resources, then you're going to the nursing home. Or that sometimes they say it positively, work with me and I'll keep you out of the nursing home. Strained or tense relationships, arguments. Again, this can be signs of elder abuse, but sometimes if you have someone who has a dementing illness, they might be very verbally abusive and argumentative, and the skills to work with that person may be lacking. Suffering is often in silence. If you notice changes, start to question. So I said two paradoxical things. We need to pay more attention. We need to intervene. At the same time, sometimes the intervention is really not warranted and the person's doing the best job they can. What do we know about risk factors? Living with someone is a risk factor, although many times it's a good thing to live with someone. Cognitive impairment and functional impairment, and that's the vulnerability. Some studies say advanced age, some studies don't. Social isolation from the support system, and to me, often this is a real red flag if someone is keeping a loved one from others. Sometimes that person, they'll say, oh, she's not well enough, she doesn't want to see you, she can't take your calls, but there is a concerted effort to keep that person from anybody who could be paying attention. Previous abuse is a risk factor. When we look at financial abuse, problems managing money, some due to cognitive impairment, but one thing that I think has been underaddressed is financial illiteracy. Sometimes the scenario of the recent widow, the spouse always did all the financial management. The person loses their spouse and they're stuck with all sorts of things to manage, and then they don't know how to do it. No, they never knew how to do it. And so how do we build support for people so that they're not at risk? Because perpetrators are out there kind of scanning, and they will do things like look at the obituary and zoom in to help. Talk briefly about cognitive impairment. Cognitive impairment is a risk factor because with cognitive impairment you start losing your ability to control your environment, to make decisions, and particularly with financial abuse. What we see with working with our law enforcement and district attorney is a lot of times they won't bring a case unless cognitive impairment is part of the vulnerability. We all are presumed to have cognitive impairment as adults in our society. That's a right that we have. But the question is, do we have the ability to make a reasoned decision? Does this elder have the ability to make a reasoned decision, to understand the premises that are being made? And one of the things that we've learned that perpetrators actually say is they look for people with mild cognitive impairments, people where nobody's paying attention because the person looks like they're functioning fine, but they can then slip in and start confusing the person. Or the fear of cognitive impairment. Sometimes they'll say, don't you remember that we had this discussion? What's the matter with you? So those are all things to kind of keep in mind. There are also multiple types of capacity that we all have in order to manage in our complex world. This is from Jennifer Moy's work. She's a psychologist at Harvard who's doing really excellent work in capacity and risk for abuse. And the ones that require a broad scope of abilities, procedural skills, are independent living and financial management. Then there's also a variety of other capacities. Those of you that have done research, you know that you need to find out, does the person have the ability to give informed consent to the research? One of the issues with elder abuse, again, is that older adults are a protected class. There's mandatory reporting. But age should not really be a consideration. So this is a double-edged sword. And when I said this to some physicians, they say, but how could it not be a consideration? One of the things that I ask people to do in looking for elder abuse, this comes out of what Jack McKay suggested, he was a pioneer in this area, take age out of the equation. So if you have somebody who's 75, who is maybe taking up with a new best friend and traveling and spending a lot of money, is that any different from somebody who's 45 and who's doing the same behavior? And if you take age out and you look at what are the characteristics of the person, how are they functioning, that's kind of an interesting test. And you can see how often we use age as a proxy for the person is 95, something should be done here. So really looking at the same situation, taking age out, and looking at, does the person understand what's going on? Can they process information? Another issue is we all have the right to folly. We all have the right to really make stupid decisions and then to live by those decisions. So what was President Bush, the first President Bush jumped out of an airplane, parachuted out at for his, what, 80th birthday? 75th? 80th. Okay, so you take age out of the equation. He jumped out of an airplane. He understood the consequences. People have the right to do, there's what, somebody who's quite advanced age who bungee jumped a few times, not something I would do. And so you look at, do people have the right to follow? Do they understand the consequences and make that part of the equation in these elder abuse questions? And it's really important to look at what their prior practices are and what their values. Sometimes you'll find people that were really tight with the checkbook their whole lives. They never spent a dime, and all of a sudden they have a new best friend and they're showering that person with gifts, and then you think, this is a bit of a red flag. Does the person understand the consequences? The Forensic Center had a really tragic case recently where a man who clearly had cognitive incapacity took up with a new best friend and a whole group of people that were associated with the new best friend. They eventually ended up taking that person out of state, beyond the reach of law enforcement. He and his money are gone, and they're enjoying the fruits of that money. That person, in going back and doing sort of an historical forensic neuropsych assessment, didn't really have the capacity to understand how he was being victimized. But had he, then he'd have the right to folly and to go off with this group to Maine. This is looking at financial management among community-dwelling older adults, and you see with age there's need for more help with financial management. So the 65 to 74-year-olds, under 5%, 85 plus, 20 to 25%. What we're seeing here, though, the white is 1992, the blue is 2004. I can't explain this, maybe some of the gerontologists in the room can, that this is going down a bit. So there were more, and maybe this is more financial sophistication, more education among that next cohort, but still there is a risk with advanced age of needing help with money management. Okay, so those are the risk factors. Again, very unclear in terms of the research, but vulnerability should be some form of incapacity that makes the person unable to manage as an adult. Who are the abusers? I should have asked you this before I turned the page. These are, again, reported abuse to APS. And the most common abusers are adult children. But who are the most common caregivers involved in care for vulnerable elders? That would also be adult children, spouses, grandchildren, and then you have a whole host of others. So I think that kind of speaks for itself. And again, because we haven't done the kind of research prevalence studies that we should, we don't know how this will look if we were to do a national prevalence study and really look at what that shows us. But this is the best information that's available. What are the characteristics of the abusers? The most striking characteristic is that the abuser has some sort of psychopathology, mental disorder, substance abuse, cognitive impairment. And this is what's striking, financial dependency on the victim. So to go back to the case scenario, a dependent older person cared for by a caregiver, that's really not what most of the more recent abuse literature shows. And Mary Joy Quinn, who works with the courts in San Francisco, has written a lot about elder abuse. She makes an interesting case that we have a breakdown in our mental health system. We have people that were institutionalized, and it's good that we've deinstitutionalized, but we don't have the community-based support systems for people who have mental disorders. So who provides care for the kids that have maybe a schizophrenic illness, bipolar disorder? Who's providing the care? That's the parents. And she says that what we see are two victims. The kid, who is actually not the caregiver, is the care receiver, and the older adult, who is aging in place, trying to manage the care of the child, and very worried that what will happen to this child when something happens to me. So she makes the case that some of what we're seeing with elder abuse is that, which is more of an indictment, I think, on the supports that we have available to people. So that takes us back to the case that I read in the beginning, the stressed caregiver, situational stress of the caregiver. And I think this is a very appealing way to think about elder abuse, because you think, what's the intervention? We provide more support to that stressed out caregiver, the mother in the sandwich generation with the adolescent kids and taking care of the mother-in-law. But in fact, most of what we see is that's not what's happening with elder abuse. Maybe some neglect, but even so, I think the jury is out on that. There's also been a lot of discussion of transgenerational violence. If you look at the violence literature, you see that violence tends to be learned in families, and the assumption that if you were abused as a child, then you are more likely to abuse your children. The question is, are you more likely to abuse an elder parent or grandparent? There was a movie with Farrah Fawcett some years ago, that was The Burning Bed, where this was the premise. She had been abused, then she became the caretaker, and she was payback. But actually the studies are not seeing that this is what's happening in elder abuse, this kind of, so there's a lot out there in the popular literature and movies and the way we think about this that really is not tested, and when we look at it and test it more carefully, we find this isn't really what's happening here. Double directional violence, that's the person who maybe has a dementing illness or some other issue who abuses the caregiver. Does the caregiver abuse them? Well, there's some evidence that sometimes that happens with dementing illnesses. So possible, but not extreme. Ageism and social exchange. This is something I'm really interested in. A lot of times you see this quid pro quo, the new best friend. You provide the money, and I provide the fun, the social support. And so what's really going on there? What are the norms and assumptions that older people make about how to keep people engaged in their life? And maybe in the discussion we can talk more about this if this is anything that you see. But the clear driver of a lot of elder abuse is the psychopathology of the perpetrator. And we'll see that again in a few minutes. So now I need to clip along. Do these theories fit? Not very well, most of them. Here's the research that we're doing very quickly. We've divided the types of elder abuse. We're just starting this with a National Institute on Aging study to look at there's different conceptual underpinnings for different types of abuse. So the financial abuse is very different a lot of times from the psychological and physical. So we're looking at sort of the conflict paradigm, intimate partner violence, child abuse, for psychological, physical, and sexual abuse. We're looking at what's underpinning these scams and what can we how do we get a handle on that. And then the caregiving paradigm might fit some of the neglect that's going on in terms of how do we help caregivers manage these complex situations. So we're just starting that. I don't really have anything to report except that that's how we're trying to think about it. How do you prevent elder abuse? One of the issues is you give workshops and things to older adults. I've done a little bit of that. My experience is they know. You can talk about financial scams. They say, yeah, we know, we've heard that, but it doesn't seem to change the behavior. A few years ago, AARP and the sheriff's office called people and said, you're on one of these boiler room scam lists, and you're being scammed, and here's how you deal with it, and when they call next time, here's what you do. Then the sheriff's office called back sometime later with a false scam. A very high proportion of people, over 90%, went right for it. So they were informed. It didn't change the behavior. I talked about mental health issues and looking at the perpetrator. There have actually been a couple of pilot studies, not even studies, pilot experiments that haven't been documented, but people have talked to me about, with support groups for perpetrators. And the amazing thing is the perpetrators say initially, I didn't really know that I wasn't supposed to do this. And one person was sharing with me, she's found in the support group that they really want to work with each other. Should I do this? How do I stop doing that? So I think there's some promise for that. Education and training, well, maybe education and training of professionals, and I'm not giving up on informing people, but I think we can't just expect knowledge to change behavior without really working on how that happens. Protective placement. You can take the older person out of the home. The sad thing about that is the older person bears the consequences of having to leave the home, and a lot of times the perpetrator is still in the home. So there are some tools, but they're really heavy weapons. Civil and criminal remedies. I'll talk more about this when I talk about the forensic center. They're out there, but I think what you have to see is quite egregious abuse to have these remedies actually work. I've been on involved with a couple of civil cases where you think, this is outrageous, this abuse, and then juries said, oh no, she deserved to have the money, or he deserved to because of the relationship. So, if I were not here with you today, I want you to know, now I don't really know anything about this one, and I'm not going to say that it's abuse, but I thought it was a really good example. I was invited today, and I've been invited several times by the same individual, to go to something, and you probably get these in the mail all the time. Sometimes they're little postcards. They say, your will of the courts, AARP says to avoid probate. Sometimes they're more sophisticated. This one is very attractive. Basically, this is the free lunch one. The other one is, check this box, we'll come to your home, we'll tell you about your finances, no obligation. So for this one, you go, you have lunch, and you get to learn all these things. And there's no expectations on your part. But there is no free lunch. I was involved with a case that the California Attorney General brought against people doing this, where basically they came in and they said, first you have to protect your assets from nursing home spend down and things. So you need a trust. We'll help you do that. They put together a trust. The purpose of putting together a trust was to find out where the money was. Once they found out where the money was, they went in and they sold their annuity product, which did not most times benefit the older adult. And they said things like, I get no commission from this. Wrong, they got a huge commission from this. This is the only way your money will be safe. Remember the Depression, it's not safe in the banks, it's not safe in investment. Look what happened to Wall Street, it's crashing. This is the hook, and I would bet that many of you have gotten this hook. And there's, this person actually says she went to USC. I thought that was curious, and probably she did. So let me just read you, and I read this before when I did the general training. This is from the training to train people how to do these kinds of annuity scams. So this is what the trainer says. Old people lie to you, and so when you work with them, always let them think they're winning. The best way to get them to trust you and get them to let you control their money is to shake them up, scare them, get them to rely on you for every decision. I use big-time fear. I make these people think they have to call me for everything. It's an acting job. You have to be good enough to convince them that you're concerned. And this training was a 3-day training. The person got a certificate that they presented when they went out to do the scam that said they were trained. This was the training, 3 days of this. And they, in this particular suit, it was about, I believe, about $250 million that had been put through these annuity. And this is one small scam. It was a civil suit. The agents then went out and started their own companies. So there's a lot of this. I also want to read, as I was coming to the podium, Jeanette gave me this. It's an email from Donna Benton 2 days ago. Today at the City of Glendale Senior Center, we had a gentleman stopping by during our congregate lunch program to solicit a longevity survey program which says seniors will receive a check for $1,000 and $250 per month for the rest of their lives. He came in asking for Social Security numbers, and the brochure he had was from Lighthouse Insurance Marketing and Survey Trust. And some of these talks actually, too, I've seen go through the senior centers. Not to say the senior center endorsed this in any way. So this says he was arrested earlier this week. He's let out 2 days ago. And so let people in your senior center know. Why is this happening? Anybody know who this is? Ethan knows. That is Willie Sutton, the original Slick Willie. He was a bank robber. He was supposed to be a spiffy dresser, so you can judge for yourself if he was good on that account. And he said he robbed banks because that's where the money is. But now the perpetrators would say, why go through all that, guns blazing, risking your life, when you can do these other schemes? Because where's the money? 3/4 of the money in this country is held by people over the age of 50. So if you can get them to sign a bunch of documents that show that they parted with their money willingly, then most you have to deal with is a civil suit. Some of the elder abuse, financial abuse stuff talks about perpetrators and opportunists. The perpetrators are people like this. They know exactly what they're doing. They go for the money. The opportunist, the family member, one comedian does this thing where he goes to grandma's house, he looks around at all the antiques, the money, and he thinks, how are you feeling, Grandma? And he does this whole thing. But I think that's kind of shows the opportunists think, well, Grandma's going to leave me the money anyway, and she doesn't need it. And so they start kind of down a path. One of the things about defining elder abuse, and the numbers I gave you, a lot of those don't include telemarketing. It's abuse by a trusted other, not abuse by these large telemarketing firms. And I'm going to show you a video quickly in a minute about that. But I thought this was interesting. Somebody gave me this. This was in the Sunday Funnies a few weeks ago. I don't know, did anybody see this? I'll just read it so you can. It says, when Little Red Riding Hood got to her grandmother's house, she saw that the ailing old woman had befriended the wolf. This sweet doggie is helping me with my estate planning. And then Little Red Riding Hood says, my, what big ears you have, Mr. Wolf. the better to hear opportunity knocking with little girl. And what big eyes you have, the better to see legal loopholes with. And what big teeth you have, the better to seize power of attorney with. With that, Red Riding Hood left to find help for her feeble grandmother. But Red Riding Hood was too late, and before her grandmother passed away, the grandmother had signed papers that left all her assets to the wolf. Sorry, kid, it's all legal. And the wolf says, now, get off my property. So here's the kids reading the story. Jeez, and I thought the original version was gruesome. Fiction is never as scary as real life, Lucy. So it's interesting that it's showing up here. And so what I wanted to show you now is, this is an old video that AARP did, but I think it gives you insights into the telemarketing aspect. So we'll just watch about 5 minutes of it. Wait, we hope. Right.
Nevada jail cell.
The lifestyle of the average telemarketer is, I think it's dominated by drugs and alcohol, gambling, heavy gambling, especially out here in Las Vegas. And if it's not one of those factors, it's just sheer greed, the drive for money, to have nice cars, nice things.
So he's a telemarketer that they caught.
Many of them make hundreds of thousands of dollars doing this.
John Hamm is a U.S. attorney for Nevada. His team of federal agents and prosecutors has busted hundreds of con artists, and Bart Chamberlain was among the worst. His scam?
In essence, it's a phone call in which you're promised that a check awaits you or is being sent to you, and you need to pay money in the form of taxes or as a handling fee.
This is enough money for you to go to your grave knowing that you went and did the right thing, and you can go and meet God with a clear conscience. Now, what do you want to do?
There is, of course, no check.
Here's how one scam works. The caller tells you you've won a big cash prize. It could be anything from $1,000 to $1 million. Let's say your prize is $25,000. But before they send it to you, you have to send them a check to cover taxes and handling fees that total 10% of the prize. So before you get your $25,000, you have to send them $2,500. You send them the money, they send you nothing. There are infinite variations on this scheme, but in all of them, you'll pay far more than you'll ever win.
And the grand prize is $25,000 in cold hard cash!
Every telemarketer in this room is telling every person they're talking to the same thing. They're reading the script from a notebook.
I would blow it out and make it sound like you were the grand prize winner. Congratulations, your numbers match up. You have been guaranteed one of the biggest awards you've ever given away. And really, hype the whole thing up. And I do that to every single person. I take you through the whole spiel about, congratulations, you won 4 round-trip airfare vacations, you won a 3D camera, you won a diamond collection, you won a discount travel card. Now I need you to write this down. There is a one-time promotional fee for $698.50. Congratulations.
Did anybody ever win the big prize?
Not that I know of, no. Because when you're getting scammed, that's the whole thing. You can't tell if the guy's a scam artist. And they sound like the person they purport to be. That's why they're making money. That's why they're good at what they do.
One of Bart's tricks was to use 3 or more phone voices to make himself sound like a large and legitimate company.
Basically, what I would do is, as far as the 3 voices are concerned, is I will be myself to start. I say, sir, my name is Bart Chamberlain. Congratulations, you've walked away with one of the biggest awards we've ever given away. $100,000 cashier's check. Congratulations to you. Now, Mr. Jones, I need you to hold on the line for just a moment. The executive vice president of the company, Charlie Miller, wants to personally congratulate you. Now, I want you to hold on. I'm a little nervous. He's my boss. Hold the line just a minute, okay? Mr. Jones, Charlie Miller here. How are you? I want to extend you a very warm and hearty congratulations on behalf of my entire staff. Congratulations to you. Mr. Jones, Bart Chamberlain here again. Well, that was my boss. I'm a little nervous. But again, when he comes in the room and congratulates you, you know you've done very well for yourself. Now, I need you to hold on the line for just one more second here. I need to get my photographer, Mr. Robert Jones, on the phone. Hold the line. Mr. Jones, my last name is Jones too. I'm Mr. Robert Jones from Mobile, Alabama. I'll be coming out to your house personally to take photographs of you. Congratulations. And that's basically it.
The con artist wants to win your trust. He may ask you about your life and tell you about his, that he's a hard-working family man with a wonderful wife and beautiful kids. The truth is often very different.
A typical day was probably that I've been up all night, partying, doing cocaine. 8, 9 o'clock, depending on what time zone I'm calling, I'll get on the phone, call the victim, tell them they need to go down to Western Union or to American Express Money Gram and wire the money. And they go down and wire the money. I go pick up money by 10 or 11 o'clock, pick up $3,000, $4,000, $5,000, pick up the money, and I'd party all day.
In other words, I sent $200, then I sent $2,000, then I sent $3,000.
Mylan Butoff likes to help people. Since he learned he has leukemia, he's had a special concern for children who suffer from cancer. So when a con artist called pretending to represent a children's cancer charity, he never checked to see if the charity was real. He sent a check, and then another, to help the kids. Or so he thought.
This $8,476 was given by me at various times because I was so in sympathy with the children and their suffering.
Any good con artist is going to use whatever the senior tells them about themselves against them. Whether if you tell me that you're a veteran of World War II, well, great, sir, I'm a veteran of Desert Storm. We've got something in common. So you always look for an angle with the victim to legitimize what you're doing and to make yourself more believable.
So, believe me, the donation goes to a very, very worthy cause. So what they do is they support children throughout the United States here.
I'm a typical guy that believes that you're helping somebody and then they end up they're just taking for a role.
Many people don't realize that telemarketing fraud is a crime. And it's a big crime. Americans are losing more than $40 billion a year to criminals using the telephone. Because the con artists are so slick, it's often difficult to tell a ripoff from a legitimate sales call. Here's some red flags that can warn you that your caller is a criminal. The caller says you've won a prize, but you must pay to receive it. The caller says you must decide right now and pressures you for your credit card or bank account number. Sometimes the con artist insists on immediate payment by wire service or overnight courier. It's a myth that all older victims of telemarketing fraud are confused, lonely, and isolated. New AARP research shows that many victims are well educated and relatively affluent. They're informed and active in their communities.
I had a case just not too long ago in which a doctor in Colorado had lost well over $100,000.
I certainly had victims that were, that were retired lawyers, United States Navy Rear Admirals, which is a very high rank in the Navy, doctors. So these were people that were very successful in their lives and held a high standing in the community in their workplace, positions of leadership, and they too fell prey and were victimized.
Ardell Schramm was financially set for life, or so her family thought. But her niece Dorothy Valek noticed something wasn't quite right. Ardell was losing weight and seemed easily upset.
And I put my arms around her and I said, you have to tell me what's wrong, because I know it can't be this bad and that we can do something about it, but I have to know what it is. And then she began to tell me. And it was bits and pieces, but it came out that she had lost all of this money and that her money was gone.
Over a 3-year period, Ardell had sent telemarketers nearly $120,000.
And you finally get to the place where you can't send them any more money. It's not so friendly then.
So now you're going to start crying again and going off on me, right?
It's abusive. It's as abusive as someone sticking a gun in your back.
You'll never ever be anything. You're going to your grave a loser. A big loser.
So I think that really captures how they work and what they do. I just want to tell you that that woman actually became an AARP crime fighter. She got those tapes by working with AARP. They did catch the people. So, and at the end, she's doing quite well. I want to save enough time for questions. I did want to share with you the Forensic Center. So, how do we prevent elder abuse? Paying attention. Sometimes this is hard if the person's been private and independent. Links to banking, although sometimes these can backfire. Family support. Have older adults who will consult with you prior to making decisions. Also agree not to make those rapid decisions that these perpetrators ask you to do. Clearly do not call lists, but now we're seeing a lot of stuff on the internet that's hard to avoid. The various banking scams, the Canadian lottery scam. There is a charity checklist to find out if charities are legitimate, but I encourage people to really be sure that what they're contributing to is legitimate. And then we find, unfortunately, the Forensic Center, people with cognitive impairment, one of the remedies is conservatorship or guardianship. It's extremely draconian. It means taking away the person's ability to make their own decisions and something to be used as a last resort. I'm going to skip through this. One thing that is a prevention is that many social service agencies, but not enough, I shouldn't say many, some are afraid of the liability, do offer daily money management services for older adults. Sometimes they can be education for the new widow who has to learn how to manage the money. Sometimes they're actually providing the service, the banking, accounting, and bill paying. They can help people set up advance directives so they have things in place to plan with. Oh, this is showing me something different. Okay. So let me, okay. What I want to end with is a program that we're evaluating as a means to address elder abuse. And it's all types of elder abuse, although interestingly what we're seeing is primarily financial elder abuse. And one of the issues with elder abuse is that it takes a team. It takes a lot of different professionals. So the forensic team starts with, these are the frontline people to combat elder abuse. You'll see something that's all filled in. It won't be linked like this. Adult Protective Services, the Public Guardian, the Ombudsman, and then add to that mental health, neuropsych assessment, the geriatrician. There is an elder death review team to look at suspicious deaths. The coroner is involved. And then law enforcement. Now, what we find for a lot of law enforcement is this kind of abuse is pretty far down on the hierarchy of issues. But LAPD and some of the sheriff's departments and cities that they cover have actually designated people to address this. So, oh, and then of course the district and city attorney who will actually prosecute the cases if they rise to that level, and civil attorneys if they're not prosecutable but could be dealt with in civil court. So it's a multidisciplinary team that provides expert consultation, and I particularly like this slide that Janine Yanashura did, she's hiding in the back of the room, because what happens is that these experts sit around a table for 2 hours every week, cases are presented, and then the discussions and the referrals happen right there in real time. Because one of the barriers is to work across the pieces of the puzzle if you're not sitting around the table. So there'll be a referral to LAPD and it gets buried on somebody's desk and nobody can find it, or APS and the Adult Protective Services and the police don't work collaboratively, so they'll be kind of working at odds. Or it clearly requires a neuropsych assessment, no, there's nobody to do that. So sitting around the table, things happen in real time, and the team decides what are the goals for the case, what are the next steps, how do we follow, how do we move forward on this? This model was launched, it's the second one in the country, there's one in Orange County as well. It was launched in January of 2006, meets over at County Hospital on the medical campus. And we're evaluating it so far. They've seen, I think, about 150. They've done about 150 cases. A lot of the cases actually take time to be addressed. So what we're learning from this is how groups work together, what the barriers are, what the outcomes of these cases are, what more information is needed, and a lot of times there's a lot more information that's needed, and then how you work these cases and how that will overall inform how we address elder abuse. Now, this is a very elegant model. This is not a resource that most communities have, but I hope it will help us then develop models off of this that could be replicable in other communities. So there's who participates. Case examination, documentation, consultation, and prosecution. Or what one of the physicians noted, if not prosecution, plea bargaining. They said sometimes it's better to have the perpetrator plea bargain and save the victim from going through the whole court case. So that's another outcome. What can you do about elder abuse? I think first to be aware of it. Build community. A lot of this happens because we live in an impersonal age and people aren't building the community that they might, knowing their neighbors, paying attention, staying in touch with friends and relatives. Sometimes you think, well, I don't want to interfere. For yourself, you can get on a do not call list. You can delete any email that looks suspicious. You should know the mandatory reporting laws and build awareness. So here's sort of summarizing. Elder abuse is a hidden problem. There's some evidence that it's increasing. There's a lot that we don't know about it, a lot of work that needs to be done. There's a lot of assumptions that are out there that may or may not be correct. We have now kind of a winner-take-all culture where money is Trump, and I think there are a lot of incentives for people to go for the money, and so I'll just leave that there. I think we need to understand a lot more about risks, who's at risk, how we screen for risk, how we build support, what are the dynamics, and then a lot more about prevention and treatment, because so far we've just vilified the perpetrators, and certainly the perpetrator you saw up there is not a very sympathetic figure, but some of the other cases of family members, how do we really build support and prevention so that we can start addressing this? And there's some resources that are in your packet, and if you start actually with the National Center on Elder Abuse, they have a really good array of resources. So I've left some time for questions.